3 years ago, my parents cut me off from the inheritance because they didn't accept my wife's humble background. However, when they found out that we are expecting our child, they suddenly showed up with gifts. I got rid of them so quickly from our home that they ended up leaving the presents behind on the way out. My wife, 29 years old, is 5 months pregnant with our first child. After 3 years without any contact, my parents appeared at our door, acting as if nothing had happened. They arrived with gifts for the baby and expected to re-enter our lives as if everything were fine. When I refused, as was predictable, these arrogant people started causing trouble. I need to start from the beginning, so it's clear why we are in this situation. Well, maybe it's not necessary. Just by saying that my parents are classist, have a strong sense of superiority, are narcissistic, and probably have some untreated disorder, you can understand quite a bit. But if they want to know the details, here they are. I grew up as an only child in a wealthy family with some social prestige. My father worked tirelessly and was successful, while my mother spent her time organizing charity events and participating in museum boards. Our house had staff who took care of the kitchen and garden maintenance. I attended private schools where most of my classmates came from similar backgrounds. I had a comfortable childhood, although quite demanding. My parents had clear expectations for my behavior, and I met them without question. When I was 26, I met my wife at a friend's wedding. She came from a completely different background, and that was precisely what attracted me. It's not that I dislike people like my parents, but I was tired of that kind of environment. Many in that circle are superficial, though not all, and lack a real connection to everyday life. Her father had worked in various jobs throughout his life, including cleaning offices in corporate buildings. Her mother also worked cleaning houses or doing small sewing jobs from home. They lived in a modest neighborhood about 40 minutes away from where I grew up. Despite having fewer resources than my family, they owned their home and raised 3 daughters who managed to attend public universities thanks to scholarships and loans. My wife and I started dating, and within a few months, I knew she was different from anyone I'd ever met. She was very hardworking and still always found time to visit her parents every Sunday for dinner. She also helped her younger sister study for exams and took her other sister wherever she needed to go when their parents didn't have a car available. When I attended those Sunday dinners, her parents seemed like the kindest people I had ever met. After 6 months of dating, I introduced who was then my girlfriend to my parents during a formal dinner at their house. The evening went well, with my parents talking to her until she mentioned her family. My wife said that her father had recently retired after working as a building maintenance manager. The atmosphere in the room immediately became tense. When my wife got up to go to the bathroom, my mother leaned toward me and asked how serious the relationship was. She said it was fine if I was just having fun, but that I couldn't be serious. I didn't want to upset my wife after dinner, so we simply left, and I told her everything on the drive home. But in the following weeks, my parents started calling me constantly. They invited me to lunch without including my wife. They suggested I attend gatherings where they could introduce me to the daughters of their friends. I never accepted any of those invitations. After a while, I decided to propose to my wife. I bought a ring and organized a simple proposal. I didn't mention it to my parents beforehand because I knew how they would react. My wife said yes, and we celebrated with her family that same night. It was one of the best nights of my life. I never told my parents about the proposal because I knew what they would say. And in fact, only 2 days passed before they found out on their own. You can't blame me. I knew I would only hear criticism about this marriage, and that's exactly what happened. They called to ask if I had lost my mind, that I was ruining my future for a woman who would never fit into our world, and that my wife was only using me for money and status. Of course, they also complained that I hadn't told them, but I told them that was precisely to avoid that reaction. Since they said that if I married her, I would no longer be their son, I did exactly that. I stopped being their son. That happened 3 years ago, and they never attended our wedding. My parents and I had no contact for 3 years. Then my wife entered her second trimester, and we announced the pregnancy on social media. I didn't think my parents would see it, as they hardly use those platforms. But someone in their circle must have shown it to them, because 2 days later, I received a call from my mother's number. My mother was on the other end of the line and congratulated me on the baby news. She even asked how my wife was doing. She and my father wanted to come visit us. I asked why she was calling after 3 years without contact. The excuse she gave was the worst I've ever heard in my life, and I hear some pretty bad things at work. She said they were hurt and needed time to heal. They were hurt after having despised my wife simply because she didn't come from a wealthy family. It's not ridiculous. It's such a level of arrogance that they should create a word just to describe them. My wife asked me who had called, and I explained the whole situation. She never told me that I should cut them off, but when I asked her what she wanted to do about them, she left the decision in my hands. so I decided not to see them. But fate, or rather these people with that sense of entitlement, didn't want that for me, because the following Saturday morning, someone knocked on our door. I opened it, and there they were, like the ugliest puppies you could ever imagine, my parents holding bags full of things for the baby. My mother asked if I wasn't going to let them in to meet the baby. I told them they couldn't come in. My mother asked how it was possible that I wouldn't let my own parents in. I replied that I would tell them when I saw them, but that I remembered perfectly well that they had said I was no longer their son. So, by simple logic, they weren't my parents either. They said they weren't cruel enough to prevent my child from being part of the family, but in reality, none of us had a relationship anymore. Yes, we shared blood, but not an emotional bond, which is the only thing that truly matters to me. The argument started to escalate, so I closed the door. My wife had heard everything from the living room and knew exactly who they were. Still, she asked who it was, and I told her they were Jehovah's Witnesses trying to sell me a timeshare. We both laughed and went on with our day. The next morning, my wife told me she felt caught in the middle between my parents and me. She didn't want to be the reason I didn't have a relationship with them, but I made it clear to her that she wasn't the reason they were. I couldn't live with myself if I accepted my parents back so easily after they had disrespected my wife. Since that weekend, my phone has been flooded with calls and messages from both of them. I never bothered to block them because they had also removed me from their lives. Among all the messages, the worst are from my mother saying she sacrificed 9 months of her life and part of her career for me, which basically means she missed a social event or refrained from drinking during pregnancy. Since after I was born, I was raised by nannies, and my father talking about how they can buy their way back into my life with money, but I don't care about money. If I did, I would have left my wife before getting married. They aren't going to buy my forgiveness, and honestly, I don't even think they are trying to apologize. Update 1. 2 weeks after my original post, my phone rang during my lunch break at work. It was my father, it was my break, and I wasn't going to spend it dealing with these people. I let the call go to voicemail. He didn't greet me. He just started saying that I had to stop this nonsense, that a medical emergency or serious situation could arise, and that I was acting like a teenager. Shortly after listening to him, he called again. This time I answered just to ask what the emergency was. He said there wasn't one at the moment, but it could happen in the future. So I suggested he call an ambulance if that ever happened, and I hung up. The following weekend, they showed up at our house again. I looked out the window and saw my parents' car parked in the driveway once more. This time, I didn't respond. I wasn't in the mood to deal with them. They rang the doorbell 4 more times. I stayed on the couch, as relaxed as possible, looking at my phone. Then I heard my mother's voice through the door saying she knew we were home because she had seen me arrive minutes earlier. Damn chocolate bar. I had to go buy. My wife is the one who's pregnant, but I'm the one with cravings. My mother said she just wanted to talk like civilized people, but they are not civilized at all. After about 15 minutes, they left, but my wife was upstairs and heard everything. She came down and said we needed to talk. First, she asked where the chocolate bar I had just bought was. That was necessary. I couldn't just sit there staring at my phone. Second, she insisted we had to go buy another one because now she had a craving too. I had to call a neighbor and ask if there were people waiting outside. I didn't see anyone, but earlier I had noticed an older couple that matched that description. I didn't even have to explain who they were. They're pretty easy to recognize. The following week, my mother called my wife directly. I don't know how she got her number, but she probably used her contacts. My mother asked how she was feeling and what the doctor had said at her recent appointments. Then she asked if she could convince me to let them visit us. My wife said she would try, but couldn't promise anything. Luckily, she didn't promise because she didn't even attempt it. My mother thanked her and said she had always liked my wife, despite what I might think. When my wife asked what she meant, my mother said they could talk about it when they saw each other in person. My wife knows her mother was trying to manipulate her by being kind and considerate, but we don't see why we couldn't play along a little. 2 days ago, my parents showed up again. This time, my wife opened the door, but there was a small detail. Before they came, we had thought about what to do if they returned. I had a Halloween costume, and we had turned off all the lights in the house. My wife opened the door, and they entered a completely dark room. This is where I come into this part of the story, jumping out dressed as this infernal creature called the mailman, which was my costume. It was terrifying because everyone is afraid of mailmen. That's why dogs always bark at them. And also because I had a knife strapped to my neck. Luckily, my parents have money because they probably had to buy new pants after the scare they got. They left the house so fast that I would be surprised if they didn't have an emergency. After that, they got into their car and drove off without saying a word, clearly very shaken. I know it may seem childish to scare your own parents, but if I don't do it now, when would I? when they're no longer alive and I can't give them that scare. Some people regret not saying I love you in time. I would have regretted not kicking them out of my house with a good scare. The only thing I regret is not planning the prank better. Maybe I could have scared them by pretending to be a poor person, but that probably would have sent them straight to the hospital, not just to change their pants. In fact, they left so quickly that they left everything behind. And no, I'm not talking about what they left in their pants, but the gifts they had brought. They threw everything on the floor and ran to their car without looking back. Edit 1. A Chewbacca costume wouldn't work. My parents would think we adopted an exotic dog. They have no idea who that character is. Edit 2. Now that I've read that story, I understand what they meant by Chewbacca. Maybe it could work at some nighttime event with all their friends present. Update 2. My wife is now 8 months pregnant and doing well physically. None of this has caused her stress, and in fact, she's having fun with the whole situation with my parents. The prank we pulled on them in the previous post made her laugh so much. I thought she might go into labor, but everything is under control. About 3 weeks ago, my wife's younger sister got engaged. The whole family was excited and organized a celebration dinner at her parents' house. We attended and spent the night overeating and admiring my sister-in-law's ring. On the way home, my wife said she felt very grateful for her family. Although she also said she appreciated mine since they had given us many hours of entertainment. And when I say many hours, I literally mean all the time we spent laughing as we remembered it. When we told the story during the engagement celebration, everyone laughed at my parents. My sister-in-law's fiance laughed so hard that he ended up spilling a drink on his pants, which made us laugh even more remembering my parents. The following week, I received an email from my father. He didn't use the usual family email. He sent it from his work email. Before you ask, because I forgot to mention it earlier, there was no reference to our little prank. I guess it was too embarrassing even to bring up. What my father did comment on in the message was whether we liked the gifts they left at our house. He didn't mention at all the way they left them scattered all over the floor as they ran from that house of horrors. Also, since we hadn't returned them, he asked if we would now be willing to reconcile. We didn't return the gifts because we donated them. They were things we already had, just more expensive, and came with the unspoken condition of allowing them to be part of our child's life. Nobody wants to make a deal with the devil. My response was to send him the website of the place where we donated the items. I don't have a donation receipt or anything like that, so I hope he got the message. I like to think he did because we haven't heard from them since. They've always tried to solve everything with money, like when they showed up with gifts to cover the past. I don't see why they couldn't just buy a grandchild. There's probably a black market for that. It actually reminds me of Homer trying to adopt a child and asking if he was blonde. For my parents, it would be like buying a new car and choosing the extras. I don't understand why they want my son. As my wife says, by their standards, he has impure blood. Update 3, our son was born 6 weeks ago. The labor was long, but my wife handled it much better than I did. The hospital vending machine didn't have chocolate bars, and it even swallowed my bill when I tried to buy something else. Her parents came to the hospital the day after the birth and spent hours holding him, taking photos, and doing all those lower class things. You'll understand why I say that later. My parents didn't find out about the birth until my wife posted a photo on social media 3 days later. My mother called as soon as she saw the post. I let it go straight to voicemail. She left a message congratulating us and asking when they could come visit. I deleted it without replying. 3 hours later, there was another call. This time with my father in the background saying something like, "You tell them." After a little back and forth, my mother finally said, "I can't believe you let people like your wife's parents spend time with him. You have no idea what things they could teach him." 2 days later, a package arrived at our house. Inside was a fairly expensive baby monitor and a card from my parents. The card said they regretted everything and wanted to erase what had happened recently. My wife left the box in the garage, which is why we forgot to donate it too. Would it be very bad if we donated the card as well? Surely someone could erase the message and use it again. The first month with our son was exhausting, but you still enjoy it because you really want to be a parent. He would wake up every 2 hours to feed. My wife got up to feed him because babies have the privilege of doing it in public and everyone sees it as adorable, but if an adult did the same, they'd probably be accused of exhibitionism. Meanwhile, I would also wake up to keep them company. Now we're starting to feed him with expressed milk so she can rest a little more. 3 weeks after our son was born, my mother showed up at our door again. I was home alone because my wife had gone to visit her parents. My mother rang the doorbell and then started banging on the door more insistently. I looked out the window and saw her standing there with another bag of gifts. I quickly went to get my bloody mailman costume and put it on. But this time, I didn't try to scare her. I simply opened the door without saying anything. She looked somewhat uncomfortable probably because the previous encounter had been quite traumatic for them. She said what she needed to say, though she avoided looking directly at me. She wanted to see my son and insisted she wouldn't leave until she could see him for at least 15 minutes. I replied that what a pity, because my wife had left me, taken our son with her parents, and I also wanted to see him for at least 15 minutes. I could see her starting to smile until I told her that my wife was trying to get full custody because she didn't think our son was safe with my parents around, that I didn't want them in his life. And that I was also paying the consequences. She started apologizing and offering the help of her expensive lawyers. But I declined the offer because they had already done enough damage. Luckily, she left about 20 minutes before my wife returned home. We laughed a lot, telling her what had happened. I don't want to sound sexist, but if my father had been there, this wouldn't have worked. There I was, dressed as a bloody mailman, saying all those things. My father didn't marry my mother for her brilliant intelligence, that's for sure. The next day, we received an email from my father asking why I had done that to my mother. It must have been a pretty strange conversation between my parents. My mother explaining what happened, and my father with a look like, I can't believe my wife fell for something like this. We replied to the email, but then my father sent a letter through his lawyer. In that letter, he said they were evaluating their rights as grandparents and might try to seek legal visitation. My wife panicked when we received that letter because my parents have enough money to spend on that kind of thing. But after a call to a lawyer and a chocolate bar, everything was sorted out. Unless my parents could prove that our son was being mistreated, it was more likely that I would stop eating chocolate. The letter was clearly intended to scare us, just like it scared my wife, so that we would end up agreeing to avoid legal trouble. They should leave the scaring games to the professionals. Last week, my mother sent a long message to my wife. She said that my father had sent the lawyer's letter without her knowing. She claimed she was furious with him for threatening legal action. She wanted to meet my wife for coffee and talk about all the bad things my father had done. My wife replied with a mailbox emoji and a nice try. We couldn't find a mailman emoji. But after my mother sent sad faces, my wife sent her some knife emojis. Everything has been laughs and tense moments since then, basically, because my parents are still themselves. For those still asking if my parents have filed a grandparent rights lawsuit, the answer is still no. I've explained before. They don't have a solid case. It's not just about hiring expensive lawyers. They would also have to prove something, and the only way they could do that legally would be to accuse us of something that isn't true. My parents have many flaws, but they wouldn't go that far. Although thinking about it, they would have a better chance suing for emotional damage or even for the pants ruined by my prank. But that idea hasn't occurred to them yet, and I hope it never does. The real chaos happened a few months ago when my parents contacted my in-laws to act as intermediaries. It was quite an extreme move, even for them since they usually don't interact with people they consider beneath their level. But the conversations were useless because my in-laws made it clear they would respect any decision my wife and I made. It must have been frustrating for my parents to do all that without getting any results. When I mentioned my prank, many people in the comments wanted to know more details. I didn't intend to sit down and tell childhood stories, but the truth is that my mother has always been a constant problem for my father in financial matters. Now, I want to share some of these stories because my mother has done something new, and I suspect my father is considering asking for a divorce. When I was around 12 years old, my mother fell victim to a scam, and my father lost a lot of money because of her. She was involved in one of her multiple charitable organizations and decided to donate $25,000. I don't remember the exact details because I was very young. I just remember my parents arguing at night. Yes, I remember that my father spent a lot of money hiring private detectives to try to find any leads since the police report didn't produce results. Then there were many lapses with money because someone would show up claiming to be the person in charge of mowing the lawn and asking for money in advance for the following week. But it wasn't the usual gardener. It was someone who knew my mother's habits and took the opportunity to steal between $100 and $200. There was even a case where someone took a valuable item from the house while she was searching her purse for money to give to the supposed worker. After that, my father had to tell her that he would handle the payments and that no one should ask her for money. That way, the scammers who wanted to take advantage of her to buy alcohol or drugs stopped having any success. The next incident happened when she was at a museum board meeting, and because of her, they acquired a stolen piece. There should have been a legal process verifying that the seller was the legitimate owner, but by hiring a questionable person and rushing the purchase, she got involved in this problem. She was removed from her position, but now she faces a lawsuit from the museum, which also has legal problems, and she will likely face lawsuits from the original owner who had had the piece stolen months earlier. That's why my father has been consulting lawyers about a possible divorce, although I think my mother doesn't know yet. Theoretically, I shouldn't know either, but here I am sharing the gossip without revealing who gave me the information. As for my parents' involvement in our son's life, that has calmed down quite a bit. It's been about 3 months since the last time they mentioned anything to me about it. Now, everything will probably be even calmer if the situation is as serious as it seems. Update 4. My parents are in the process of divorcing, but if you read my previous post, it's not my fault or my wife's. My mother hired a competent lawyer, perhaps on my father's recommendation, and reached an out-of-court settlement with the museum and the owner. The charges were also dropped because they caught the person who sold them the piece. My mother is only paying for not having taken the necessary precautions to ensure the artwork wasn't stolen. It was negligence, but there was no ill intent on her part. Even so, my parents are divorcing and my father is moved into one of his properties. The division of assets will be total chaos, but my father is exhausted because he constantly has to explain to his partners and friends what is happening with my mother. The good news is that they haven't bothered us since the beginning of last year. I don't think my father is all that interested in our son. He's never been very paternal. And my mother, it would be a miracle if she doesn't lose a large portion of her money once the divorce is finalized. Don't expect me to continue writing about this story because it originally was about my wife and our son, and now it has turned into a soap opera about divorces in wealthy families. I don't want to give any more details because even though I no longer care about my parents, it wouldn't be hard for someone to get information about me or my family if they recognize us. In fact, someone has been suspiciously attentive with a comment in private messages. I think it's best to leave the story here.